that's their son.
Exactly.
And they had one son, and that's Alexei.
Exactly.
Right.
For almost 100 years, the fate of Russia's last royal family remained one of the 20th century's most haunting puzzles. Rumors of secret survivors, impostors claiming royal blood, and the legendary tale of a missing princess kept the mystery alive. But with time, modern science unearthed shocking evidence that shattered the stories we thought were true. Buried deep in Russian soil lay answers long concealed, and a grim truth no one wanted to face. DNA testing finally solved the Romanov mystery, and the revelation is chilling. The last Tsar falls. For more than 3 centuries, the Romanovs weren't just rulers of Russia, they were Russia. Their dynasty shaped the nation's soul, built glittering palaces, expanded borders, and established the Russian Empire as a force that Europe both admired and feared. But by the early 20th century, the golden facade was cracking. Decades of war, famine, and unrest had eaten away at the empire's foundations, and the weight of history pressed down with crushing inevitability. Russia's story as an empire started long before the Romanovs, with fierce resistance to the Mongol Tatar rule in 1480. After uniting its fractured principalities by 1523, Russia pushed back the Turks and began forging its path as a global power. Under Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, Russia surged forward. Ivan captured Kazan and Astrakhan, stretched into Siberia, and modernized the military and government, laying the groundwork for an empire that would one day dominate vast swaths of Europe and Asia. Then came 1613, the birth of the Romanov dynasty. After expelling the Polish invaders, a national council in Moscow, representing nobles, clergy, and merchants, elected Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov as Tsar. His reign stabilized a fractured Russia, ending wars and reforming the state with the help of metropolitan fillarets. Under Mikhail, Russia began to resemble Western powers, politically and administratively, though it still lagged far behind economically and technologically. But Russia's ambition knew no bounds. It needed warm water ports to thrive, beyond the lonely northern port of Arkhangelsk. Peter I, or Peter the Great, would change everything. A curious, forward-thinking czar, Peter traveled to Western Europe, returning with big ideas. He modernized Russia's army, opened factories, founded schools in medicine and navigation, and even banned longbeards and heavy veils to push Russia toward a European image. His reign was marked by wars against Poland, Sweden, and Turkey. The decisive victory in the Great Northern War against Sweden allowed Peter to expand Russia's reach into the Baltic, where he built a new capital that's now known as St. Petersburg, a dazzling window to the west. Under his rule, Russia became a modern, centralized empire and a true European powerhouse. But after Peter's death, chaos reigned. Weak rulers came and went until his daughter, Elizabeth, brought stability and extravagance back to the court. Catherine II, Catherine the Great, would elevate the empire even further. Through wars and reforms, she expanded Russia to the Black Sea, crushed rebellions like Pugachev's uprising, and positioned Russia as a dominant world power. By the late 1700s, the Romanovs were one of Europe's most formidable dynasties. Russia's victories continued. They gained Crimea and the right to protect Christians within the Ottoman Empire. Even Napoleon's massive invasion in 1812 failed spectacularly when Russian forces burned Moscow, luring the French into a devastating retreat. Out of 700,000 soldiers, fewer than 100,000 stumbled home. By the mid-1800s, however, cracks began to show. While Western Europe industrialized and abolished feudal systems, Russia clung to serfdom, millions of peasants bound to the land and their lords. Peasant uprisings surged, with more than 500 revolts between 1825 and 1855. Hunger and poverty fueled unrest, and even the mighty Russian army began losing its fearsome reputation, especially after the humiliating defeat in the Crimean War. Tsar Alexander II attempted to modernize. In 1861, he emancipated 22 million serfs, followed by 25 million more on state-owned estates. But this freedom came with strings attached. The newly freed peasants received the worst land and were saddled with crippling rent payments. Alexander reformed courts, education, and the military, but dissatisfaction persisted. After surviving one assassination attempt, his increasingly authoritarian rule ended violently in 1881 when he was killed by revolutionaries. Although that's not the killing that grabbed the attention of the whole world, this set a precedent for what's to follow. By the early 1900s, Russia was a powder keg. The Russo-Japanese War was a disaster, humiliating Russia on the world stage and further stoking anger. On January 22, 1905, thousands of workers marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Instead, soldiers opened fire, killing hundreds, maybe thousands. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. Revolution erupted. Strikes, barricades, and street battles swept through the empire. Though the uprising was crushed, it forced Nicholas to concede reforms, including the creation of the Duma, Russia's parliament. Still, Nicholas retained near-absolute power. The Romanovs' grip on the throne remained, but just barely. Then came World War I. Russia suffered catastrophic losses. In a disastrous move, Nicholas personally took command of the army, tying himself directly to every defeat. Meanwhile, back in the capital, his wife Alexandra fell under the sway of Grigory Rasputin, a mysterious mystic whose influence scandalized the court and enraged the public. By 1917, food shortages and misery pushed workers, many of them women, to the breaking point. On March 8th, tens of thousands took to the streets of St. Petersburg, demanding bread, peace, and change. Soldiers, ordered to suppress the protests, began defecting to the demonstrators. It was the beginning of the end. As chaos consumed Russia, the Duma formed a provisional government. Realizing his empire was slipping away, Nicholas II abdicated, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. The dynasty that had once built palaces, toppled empires, and ruled the largest country on earth was no more. What followed would be bloodier and more chaotic than anyone could imagine, and the Romanovs themselves would soon face a tragic fate that would haunt history for generations. The night of the end. The summer of 1918 was unbearably tense for the Romanovs. Once the most powerful family in Russia, they were now prisoners of the very revolution they had tried to suppress. Their world had shrunk to the confines of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, a gloomy mansion turned into a fortress. The windows were painted over so thickly that not a single ray of sunlight or glimpse of the outside world could get through. Even their daily walks in the garden, once a tiny escape from their suffocating captivity, had been stopped entirely. Inside those walls, silence weighed heavy. Conversations were hushed, and every creak of the floorboards sent waves of unease through the house. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one knew exactly when. Outside, the anti-Bolshevik forces known as the White Army were pushing forward, threatening to take Yekaterinburg. For the Bolsheviks guarding the royal family, this was a nightmare scenario. If the Whites captured the Romanovs, they could restore the monarchy, undoing everything the revolutionaries had fought for. The solution, at least to the Bolshevik leadership, was horrifyingly simple: eliminate the Romanovs before they could be rescued. As midnight passed on July 16th, the household was restless. Then, in the earliest hours of July 17, footsteps echoed through the halls. Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik officer in charge, ordered the family to get dressed. He told them they were being moved for their safety, a believable lie considering the approaching battle outside the city. Nicholas II, Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the frail young Alexei, along with 4 loyal attendants, including the family doctor, shuffled sleepily into line. They were exhausted, anxious, and completely unaware that this relocation was, in fact, a death sentence. Even the family dog followed faithfully at their heels. The group was led down to a small, dimly lit basement room. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. Alexandra, who was unwell, asked for a chair, and Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia and could barely walk, was also seated. The others stood in a tense semicircle, clutching each other's hands, waiting for instructions. And then, the trap was sprung. Yurovsky entered with a group of armed men, their rifles at the ready. His voice was cold and final as he announced, "The Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Nicholas, stunned, turned toward him and reportedly asked, "What? What did you say?" Those would be among his last words. The quiet shattered with the deafening crack of gunfire. The small room erupted in chaos. Smoke filled the air as bullets ricocheted off the stone walls. Screams and confusion echoed through the basement. In the frenzy, many shots went wild. To the shock of the executioners, some of the Romanov daughters didn't fall immediately. The reason? Hidden beneath their dresses, the girls had sewn jewels and diamonds, the last remnants of the family's immense wealth, into their corsets and hems. These makeshift armor plates deflected bullets, leaving them injured, but not dead. This unexpected twist enraged the executioners, who realized they'd have to finish the job by hand. As the smoke cleared and the room grew quiet again, the scene was nightmarish. Those still alive were mercilessly stabbed with bayonets, then shot at point-blank range to ensure there were no survivors. Even the family dog was killed. By the time it was over, the floor was slick with blood. The last Romanov Tsar, his wife, his children, and those who had remained loyal to them were gone. Over 3 centuries of imperial rule ended not with a grand revolution in the streets, but in a cramped basement lit by a single flickering bulb. The Bolsheviks didn't just want them dead, they wanted their very existence erased. On July 17, 1918, Russia's royal family was gone, not only to prevent their rescue, but to destroy any hope of the monarchy ever rising again. The execution of the Romanovs was more than just a brutal act of war, it was a symbolic severing of Russia's past. With the Tsar's blood spilled in that basement, the old world was dead, and a new revolutionary order was ready to take its place, one that would change the course of history forever. Buried in secrecy. The entire bloody massacre had lasted barely 20 minutes, a single, horrifying burst of chaos that wiped out more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. But for the killers, the nightmare wasn't over. As dawn crept across Yekaterinburg, the air hung heavy, thick with smoke and fear. Inside the basement of the Ipatiev house, the floor was slick with blood, the walls scarred by wild gunfire. But now the Bolshevik executioners faced a new, grim problem: how to erase the evidence of what they'd done. The royal corpses, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal attendants, were bundled together like grotesque parcels. Their very existence was now a dangerous secret. If the advancing White Army discovered their remains, it could ignite a counter-revolution and undo everything the Bolsheviks had fought for. Hiding the bodies wasn't just important, it was essential. So, under cover of darkness, the group loaded the corpses into the back of a truck. The vehicle rumbled out of the city, slipping through the night toward a place known as the Four Brothers Mine, an abandoned, gaping wound in the forest. The plan was simple: dump the bodies into the shaft, destroy what they could, and let the earth swallow the rest. Once there, the killers worked feverishly. Jewelry and personal items were stripped away to prevent future identification. Then, in a desperate and grisly move, they doused the bodies in sulfuric acid, the fumes rising into the cold night air. The acid hissed and burned, eating at flesh and clothing, a macabre attempt to erase the Romanovs from history. One by one, the bodies were shoved into the black mouth of the mine. But almost immediately, the plan began to unravel. The shaft wasn't deep enough. When the last body was thrown in, limbs still jutted out grotesquely from the opening. It was an unmissable sign of the crime, and in that moment, terror gripped the executioners. If the advancing White Army or even local peasants stumbled across the site, the discovery could expose everything. Panic spread like wildfire through the group. They scrambled to undo what they'd just done, hauling the mutilated corpses back out of the pit. Now, after their rough handling, the bodies were even more degraded, an unholy mess of blood, ash, and acid burns. The mood grew frenzied. In their desperation to prevent identification, the executioners turned to outright desecration. Faces were smashed with rifle butts, bones shattered, and torsos hacked apart. Some of the bodies were even partially burned. The violence was wild, rushed, and fueled by fear. It was as if the executioners believed that by destroying the Romanovs' physical forms, they could destroy the very idea of them. Meanwhile, time was slipping away. The cover of night was fading to a pale gray dawn. With every passing moment, the risk of discovery grew. The truck carrying the bodies even got stuck in a swampy patch of forest road, adding yet another layer of chaos to an already desperate mission. Finally, a new burial site was chosen. A secluded clearing, hidden beneath heavy brush and fallen branches. There, a shallow grave was dug, crude, hurried, and unceremonious. 9 of the victims, Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and the loyal attendants, were dumped into the pit in a tangled heap. Sulfuric acid was poured over them again, along with quicklime to hasten decomposition. Then the grave was covered with earth, rocks, and branches. But 2 members of the family were singled out for a different fate. Young Alexei, the fragile heir to the throne, and one of his sisters, later identified as Maria. For reasons still debated by historians, perhaps to confuse future investigators or to ensure no single grave contained the entire family, these 2 bodies were taken a short distance away. Just 70 meters from the first grave, beneath a tangle of tree limbs and grass, a second, smaller pit was dug. There, the boy and his sister were buried separately, isolated even in death from the rest of their family. When the final shovelful of dirt was thrown and the clearing was once again silent, the men exhaled in shaky relief. There were no markers, no signs, nothing to suggest that beneath the forest floor lay the last Tsar of Russia and his family. By sunrise, the murderers had vanished back into Yekaterinburg, leaving the Romanovs to disappear into myth. For decades, the truth of what happened that night was hidden by Soviet authorities. Officially, nothing was confirmed. Whispers spread, and rumors flourished. In reality, the Romanov story was buried beneath layers of dirt, acid, and lies. The location of the graves remained a closely guarded secret, fueling speculation and legend. The violent disposal of the bodies was more than a cover-up. It was a symbolic act. The Bolsheviks hadn't just killed the Romanovs. They'd tried to erase them, to sever Russia from its imperial past completely. But history has a way of clawing back to the surface. And even though the forest was silent on that July morning, the truth of what happened refused to stay buried forever. Whispers and pretenders. As the world reeled from the shocks of World War I and the Russian Revolution, one mystery gripped the global imagination. What had truly happened to the Romanov family? The Bolsheviks were silent. There were no photos, no graves, no admissions, only a single statement that Tsar Nicholas II had been executed. The fate of his wife, Alexandra, and their 5 children? Officially, they were being kept safe in an undisclosed location. That was it. A vague, calculated silence. And into that silence, rumors rushed in like a flood. Some whispered that the Romanovs had been spirited away by loyalists. Others swore they'd seen Anastasia or Alexei escape in the dead of night. Telegrams buzzed with unconfirmed sightings, and newspapers fanned the flames with wild speculation. Even when reports of a massacre in Yekaterinburg leaked out, many refused to believe it. Surely at least one of the royal children had survived, hidden somewhere, waiting to return and reclaim the throne. This desperate hope soon took human form. In 1920, a mysterious young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin after a failed suicide attempt. She spoke little at first, but soon began whispering a shocking claim. She was Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest Romanov daughter. Anna Anderson, as she came to be known, had an uncanny resemblance to Anastasia. She bore scars consistent with injuries the royal family might have suffered during their imprisonment, and she knew intimate details about palace life, facts few outsiders could have guessed. Her story became a global sensation. Supporters saw her as a living miracle, proof that at least one Romanov had survived that bloody night in Yekaterinburg. Skeptics saw her as a con artist hungry for fame and fortune. Court cases dragged on for decades as Anderson fought to be legally recognized as Anastasia. Photographs were compared, handwriting analyzed, memories tested. Meanwhile, books, plays, and later films transformed her story into a cultural phenomenon. Anastasia became less a person and more a symbol of hope, a reminder that innocence might endure even in the face of brutal revolution. But beneath the glamour and romance, one question refused to fade. Was Anna Anderson truly Anastasia, or was the world being fooled by a very clever imposter? In the 1970s, decades after the execution, a Russian geologist named Dr. Alexander Avdonin made a chilling discovery near Yekaterinburg. Buried beneath layers of soil and brush lay a hidden mass grave. Inside were 9 skeletons. Avdonin, terrified of Soviet retribution, kept the discovery secret. It wasn't until after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 that he revealed the truth. The remains were exhumed and analyzed. Forensic scientists confirmed they belonged to Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 loyal servants. But 2 bodies were missing: Alexei, the hemophiliac heir to the throne, and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. The absence of those 2 bodies reignited old suspicions. Could they have escaped after all? By the 1990s, science was ready to challenge nearly a century of rumor and romanticism. DNA analysis, then a cutting-edge tool, offered a way to settle the Romanov mystery once and for all. Samples were taken from the exhumed bones, and scientists traced the royal family's maternal lineage through mitochondrial DNA. To compare the results, they turned to one of Alexandra's living relatives, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His DNA would serve as a vital reference point. The results were clear and undeniable. The remains in the mass grave were indeed Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. This was scientific proof that the massacre had happened exactly as the Bolsheviks feared the world would one day discover. But there was still a catch: 2 bodies were missing. The legend of survival wasn't dead yet. Even after the discovery of the Romanovs' remains, Anna Anderson's shadow loomed large. She had spent decades battling in court, hoping to prove she was Anastasia and claim the Romanov fortune. In 1970, after the longest case in German history, the court reached an unusual verdict. Neither side had enough evidence to prove or disprove her claim. It wasn't until after her death in 1984 that science delivered the final blow. Tissue samples preserved from Anderson were tested and compared to the Romanovs' DNA. The verdict was irrefutable. She was not related to the Romanovs at all. Instead, the results matched the family of Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had mysteriously vanished in Berlin around the same time Anderson appeared. The truth was as heartbreaking as it was inevitable. Anna Anderson had been living a lie, whether intentional or not. The discovery of the graves and the DNA revelations finally solved one of history's greatest mysteries. The Romanovs hadn't escaped. There had been no secret rescue, no hidden heirs waiting in exile. Yet, the allure of their story lingers. Even today, conspiracy theorists question the official narrative, driven by the same hunger for mystery that once fueled the legend of Anastasia. The cold, hard facts have closed the case. But the dream remains, a dream of a lost princess slipping through the grasp of history, forever hiding just out of reach. In the end, the Romanovs were more than a royal family. They were a symbol of an era's violent end, of myths born from tragedy, and of a world's desperate need to believe in miracles, even when none were left to find. Well, there remains missing pieces in this narrative. In this case, missing remains. This left the world wondering what the fate of the two missing remains were. The missing children. For nearly 2 decades, the mystery of the Romanovs was like an open wound that refused to heal. Even after the dramatic discovery of a mass grave in the late 1970s, there was something hauntingly incomplete about the story. 9 bodies were unearthed, confirmed to be Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 loyal attendants. But 2 were missing. The young heir, Tsarevich Alexei, the fragile boy whose life had once been the hope of the entire dynasty, and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. Their absence wasn't just a detail, it was a spark, and it ignited a wildfire of rumors. When it comes to mysteries, a lack of evidence can be as powerful as proof. The missing children became a blank canvas for wild theories. Perhaps, some whispered, loyalists had smuggled Alexei and his sister to safety in the chaos after the execution. Others believed the Bolsheviks had hidden the truth, fabricating the massacre to crush monarchist resistance. Newspapers, royalists, and even governments fanned the flames. Every vague sighting of a young aristocrat, every woman claiming to be Anastasia or Maria, every dramatic confession from a supposed witness, all of it was amplified by one undeniable fact. There were 2 missing bodies. The lack of remains became, paradoxically, its own kind of proof. Proof to some that the story wasn't over. Proof that somewhere, 2 Romanovs had slipped through the cracks of history. The truth didn't surface until the summer of 2007, almost 90 years after that bloody night in Yekaterinburg. 3 amateur archaeologists, driven less by formal credentials and more by relentless passion, scoured a wooded area near the original grave. It wasn't a random search. They were following scraps of historical testimony, whispers passed down through generations. Just 70 meters away from the first burial site, they found what the world had been waiting for: small, broken, and scorched fragments of bone, several teeth, pieces of a skull. It was immediately clear that this was no carefully planned burial. It was the panicked work of men, desperate to erase evidence before dawn broke. The discovery was as chilling as it was incomplete. Forensic scientists got to work. The fragments were studied meticulously, every shard catalogued, every mark analyzed. Their conclusion? The bones belonged to a young male, aged 12 to 15, and a young female, aged 15 to 19. The ages lined up perfectly with the missing Romanovs. Alexei had been just shy of 14, his body frail and weakened by hemophilia. His sister, whether Maria or Anastasia, would have been a teenager standing at the threshold of adulthood. But science doesn't run on close enough. The fragments were sent to multiple laboratories for advanced DNA testing. Using mitochondrial DNA sequencing, scientists compared the genetic material to living Romanov relatives, including samples from Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, a grandnephew of Tsarina Alexandra. The results came back crystal clear. The remains were indeed Alexei and his sister. After nearly a century of rumor, the legend of survival was shattered by the cool, precise language of science, virtually irrefutable evidence. You'd think this would have ended the debate, but the Romanovs' story has never been simple. The Russian Orthodox Church initially refused to recognize the remains, even when the first 9 bodies were given a state funeral in 1998. Senior church officials didn't attend, arguing that the evidence wasn't strong enough. When Alexei and his sister were finally identified in 2007, the church remained hesitant. Their remains were placed in a state archive instead of being buried with the rest of the family in the Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. The DNA verdict. By 2018, the results were announced. Once again, the tests confirmed the remains were unquestionably those of Alexei and his sister. Even with this confirmation, some within the church continue to question the findings, proof that sometimes belief clings harder than fact. The discovery of the second grave was supposed to solve the mystery and close a chapter of Russian history that had remained painfully open. With all 11 victims accounted for, the Romanov story could finally be told in full. A dynasty brutally extinguished, a family erased in secrecy, their memory twisted into myths and legends. Yet even as science provides answers, the allure of the mystery remains. To satisfy skeptics, Russian investigators reopened the case in 2015, subjecting the remains to yet another round of genetic testing. The bone fragments of the two missing Romanov children, Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia, were carefully packed and shipped to some of the most advanced forensic laboratories in the world. This wasn't just another case for these scientists. It was one of the greatest historical mysteries ever, a puzzle the world had been trying to put to bed for decades. The Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in the United States and the Institute for Legal Medicine in Innsbruck, Austria, were tasked with the challenge. And make no mistake, this was no easy feat. The remains had endured nearly 9 decades underground, not to mention the Bolsheviks' frantic attempts to destroy them with acid, fire, and blunt force. The DNA they were working with wasn't just damaged, it was shattered, like trying to piece together a burned, torn-up photograph. But by now, modern genetics had become almost miraculous. The scientists began with mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down from mother to child, unchanged through generations. It's like a biological family heirloom, perfect for solving cases involving maternal bloodlines. The sequences extracted from the bones were further compared to known samples. When the sequences lined up perfectly, there was no denying it. The remains belonged to a daughter of Alexandra, but that was only the first step. Next came autosomal STR testing, a method that examines repeating markers inherited from both parents. Think of it as a genetic fingerprint that can confirm parent-child relationships. The results were clear and conclusive. Both the young male and young female were biological children of Nicholas II and Alexandra. To be absolutely certain, scientists turned to YSTR testing, which tracks markers passed down from father to son. The boy's DNA was compared to that of a living Romanov relative, a descendant of Nicholas II's brother. The match was perfect. The numbers were staggering. The statistical likelihood that these bones belonged to unrelated individuals was so tiny, it could barely be measured. We're talking probabilities in the trillions. In other words, it was scientifically impossible for these remains to belong to anyone but Alexei and his sister. The verdict was ironclad. After almost 90 years of speculation, the mystery was solved, not through dramatic confessions or hidden diaries, but through the cold, clear language of science. And the truth? It was devastating. For decades, people had clung to romantic tales of survival. There were movies, novels, and countless whispered stories about Anastasia fleeing to Paris, or Alexei being smuggled to safety by loyalists. But the DNA evidence destroyed those stories. There was no miracle, no fairy tale ending. What remained was grim, but undeniable. The Romanovs didn't vanish into myth or mystery. They died together, and their remains told the tale. The Romanov mystery had finally been solved, and the answer wasn't good. Watch out for more videos like this. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.